Hi, and welcome to today's edition of Rabbi Ron in the House. This week in our Parsha reading, it's Leviticus chapter 16. It's actually about the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The feast of the Lord, Yom Kippur, doesn't take place until the fall, but Leviticus is where the Parsha is, and so that's what we have for today. Whenever I look at Leviticus 16, I always think of the scapegoat. I love reading the story and seeing all about the scapegoat. I always love hearing terms that people use in everyday language and then learning about where those terms originated from. And a scapegoat is a term that we use in our lives today in all sorts of different settings. Sports is one that comes to my mind very quickly when I hear scapegoat. You have a baseball team. You get players that get injured and cannot play. You get a player that gets injured, but he decides he's going to be tough and play through those injuries, but he does, and he's not able to perform anywhere near his capabilities. And then you have to bring in other players to replace him. What's the result usually? The team doesn't win as many games as they did before. Their losses increase and their wins decrease. What happens? Eventually, the manager gets fired. He becomes the scapegoat. It wasn't his fault. He had players that were talented, that was good, but they were not capable due to injuries to actually play. Or in other cases, they get a team and then the management trades away the players and they just don't have the quality players that they need to win. But what happens in that setting? The same thing. The manager becomes the scapegoat and they say you couldn't motivate them, you couldn't equip them, you couldn't lead them. And too often the manager takes the fall for the players. The faults of the players are placed and laid upon the manager and the coaches of the team. That's exactly what happens in Leviticus on Yom Kippur. Every year, the Feast of Yom Kippur takes place. It's the national Day of Atonement for the entire nation of Israel. And part of the ceremony, the worship experience with God, is that they take two animals, one a live goat, one that is the scapegoat. And then the high priest comes and lays his hands on the head of the scapegoat. And when he lays his hands on the head of the scapegoat, all the sins of every person in the land of Israel are transferred through the priest and onto the lamb. Just like all the faults of the players were transferred to the manager and the coaches, all the sins of the people are transferred to the scapegoat. He then bears the fault, the sins of all the people. He was innocent. He didn't commit murder. He didn't lie. He didn't steal. But all those sins were placed on the scapegoat. At the beginning, the scapegoat was led out into a solitary place so he would be left there to die. Eventually, when the nation expanded and there was no solitary place nearby, they'd push him off the cliff so that the animal would meet its death. Death would pay the price for the sins of Israel. But what you have is there was a scapegoat. Instead of every one of us dying, God says every year, the first year, all humans would be wiped out. And we can't do that. He loves us too much. And so one animal gets to be the scapegoat there on Yom Kippur for the whole nation. All our sins are laid upon him. And he dies in our place. And what does that sound like to you when you think of spiritually? Yeshua, our Messiah. All of our sins, God said we can't keep doing this every year, year after year, as well as all the other sins every day in the temple. And so Yeshua the Messiah would bear our sins. We'll talk about this more in the coming days. Thanks for joining me. This has been Rabbi Ron in the House.